I think one of the key things, and it's not just go-to-market hiring, but it's just overlooked in hiring in early stage companies in general, is testing a candidate's intrinsic motivation to join you. Every good salesperson wants to earn a commission, or they want to hit their quota and earn their commission. Big company experience is rarely, if ever, backward compatible with the early stages, even if you may have been on that journey. That's the biggest reason where I find that mishires earlier failed, is they're not a stage fit.
Welcome to Human First, the go-to-market hiring show. I'm Danielle Parker, head of marketing at Captivate Talent. Most founders approach their first go-to-market hire the same way. They do a bit of Googling, they pull the bits that they like from one company that might be similar or another one that's really successful, and then they put it out in the world and start getting people into their funnel. The problem is that a job description is not a hiring plan, and it might not fully match what you're actually looking for in the role. There's almost a guarantee that you'll end up testing for the wrong things. Starting there almost guarantees that you're looking for the wrong things and you'll end up hiring the wrong person. And you won't know until it's too late. Today's guest has spent 2 decades watching exactly that happen, and he has developed a very clear framework for doing it differently. Rav Dhaliwal is a partner at Crane Ventures, and he spent the first half of his career as an operator, building go-to-market teams at Slack, Zendesk, and Yammer. And now he spends his days helping founders navigate these decisions. Welcome, Rav. Well, we're so excited to have you here today, Rav, and I want to jump right into our questions here. And I think it's really interesting to speak with you today because you've been kind of on both sides of hiring. You've been an operator building a team, and now you're an investor watching founders make these first hiring decisions. So I want to set the stakes right from the beginning. What does a hiring mistake look like in the early stage or at this stage? And not in theory, in practice, what does it cost when it goes wrong?
So I'm sort of fond of this term management debt. Yeah, so we're all sort of familiar with tech debt. We build code and maybe ship it out. It's not so great, and we kind of suffer for that in the future. And I'm thinking, especially in an early stage company, a mishire, especially on the commercial side, it creates what I call management debt. So some of those signals of those debt is you're still really busier than you think you should be because, you had actually hired someone to take some of that stuff off you. You're stressed. You feel like you can't rely on, the hire. You're spending more time on corrective action or fixing mistakes. And these are sort of signals that, management debt is starting to accrue. And then depending on the role, sometimes there's leading indicators and lagging. So I think in engineering roles, you're going to commit code pretty quickly. You're going to start to see a pattern of whether, there's a quality issue there or a quality of code. But when it comes to commercial roles, that's a little trickier because the lagging indicators are really lagging. It'll often be maybe 9, 10, 12, 18 months before you realize, whoa, this isn't working. The real problem there is the more time, the more missed opportunity, the more runway burn. And I think that's the real risk, especially when it comes to a commercial style role where the indicators are more lagging. There's more time that you have to wait before you realize there's a problem.
Yeah, and we see that a lot at the early stage too, and sometimes this sunk cost where you're like, oh no, I just got to give them a little more time. I got to give them a little more time.
Exactly, yeah. And so yeah, okay, they need a quarter to onboard. They need 2 quarters to build pipeline. They need a quarter to execute. Well, that's just a year or plus coming up now, right? And then there is another quarter of, well, if we have these features I could sell, so we need to build those features, and then it just keeps compounding. So yeah, you have the sunk cost fallacy, right? Well, we've gone through all this issue of hiring and onboarding, and we've just got to keep giving them a chance. Maybe it will come good, kind of thing.
And we spoke about this a little bit before, and before we even get into who you should hire or the process of finding that person, there's a question before that founders sometimes skip entirely. Is this actually the right time to hire? Is it the right time to make a go-to-market hire at all? And how do you now in your role help a founder work that out?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and one that is definitely overlooked, especially if you're in a competitive or hot space and you've been able to raise a lot of money. The temptation is to start spending that money, maybe spending that money on, I'll go hire a bunch of salespeople or God forbid, a sales leader at that very, very early stage. And so you have to think about timing and you have to think about the stage at where you're at. So I think at a broad level, if you're thinking about commercial hires, let's say we're thinking, our investors told us to go hire an AE, right? Well, First of all, you have to think about a couple of things. Do I have at least one ideal customer profile market that I've identified that I've actually been able to repeatedly sell to, right? That's one thing. Two, do I have at least a prototype or MVP version of a sales process I could teach somebody, even if it's very rudimentary? And three, do I have a consistent way of generating qualified opportunities and pipeline for that ICP market? And if I don't, it's not the right time to hire a commercial person, right? Because you actually, unfortunately, as a founder, have to figure out all those pieces yourself. And actually, you're the best placed person to figure those pieces out. Then you might be able to think that the timing might be right to hire a more commercial person. But usually, that first commercial hire isn't actually a salesperson. It's probably more of like, sometimes I've heard it described as a commercial associate. It's kind of more of, I'm earlier in my career, maybe a grad type person or almost like an intern type person who wants to work in tech, wants to work in the commercial side. I'm going to sit next to you, founder who's selling, and then I'm going to start helping you with what I've heard termed as the grunt work. You're doing all the thinking work, and I'm all doing doing the outreach, generating pipeline, booking meetings, building decks, and I'm slowly taking more and more things from you. So that eventually, hopefully, I'll be able to start doing the first calls or the second calls or the demos, etc., and progress. So it's normally that's kind of an early hire, or someone who's just focused on generating pipeline might be an early hire. You have to have those three things I mentioned in place before you have any kind of hope of thinking about hiring an account exec that will be successful.
And you also have a really interesting framework for doing that at like the account exec level, and a way of kind of working backwards from like the OTE target to pipeline to figure out like whether the business can support the hire or not. Can you walk us through that? Because I think it's really interesting and important for founders to even have this like mental model in their head.
Yeah, I mean, I think framework's a pretty generous way of describing it, Danielle. It's really it's just math, as you'd say in the States, or maths, as we'd say in the UK. A lot of founders these days are from technical backgrounds. They're engineers, research scientists, so they
So they
respond.
like math.
They like math, right? Yeah, exactly. Which is why they do what I do, and I do what I do. But if you think about it, is every good salesperson wants to earn a commission, right? Or they want to hit their quota and earn their commission, or over earn on it. And so typically, the way that compensation is structured, there's a base component and there's a commission component, and combined they make your on target earnings. So let's keep it simple. I'm on 150K base, so at my 150K commission, my OTE is 300. All a good salesperson wants to do is to earn that money. That's it, right? That's their prime motivation. So for 150K commission, the standard commission rate is 10%, which means in the first year, I have to close $1.5 million of business. In order to close $1.5 million of business, at a minimum, the business needs to have 3 to 4x of qualified pipeline in order to close that million. So that's going to be somewhere between 4.5 and 6 million in qualified pipeline. Otherwise, there's no hope for that salesperson to make that commission, right? And to be successful.
That's going to make everybody frustrated.
A lot of founders push back on me and go, well, the salesperson will generate that pipeline, right? Well, at best, you would expect them to do somewhere between 30 to 50% of the pipeline. So that's only half, right, of what they need to be able to do. There has to be an engine that's adding at least the other half, if not more. But that then presupposes you have already identified at least an initial customer profile that you know you can sell successfully into. So sometimes just working backwards from the target that you want to set and the OTE you're going to have to pay can just help make it a little bit clearer that maybe the timing isn't right.
Yeah, or maybe you need to look for that hire you were just talking about, that like out of school that's really hungry to learn and is going to sit by you and take that grunt work. And even I want to go back to something you said a minute ago about like, oh, my investors want me to make this hire. And we see that a lot. Like a lot of founders kind of make this hire because investors are pushing them to. They're like, okay, you just raised a bunch of money. You have to go hire these account execs, these BDRs. How do you push back on that? And what do you say to a founder who's been, maybe told by another VC that they need to hire AEs, start scaling when the fundamentals aren't quite there yet?
But as we're saying, I think one way to deal with investors is who may be suggesting that you do this, or maybe even applying some pressure if you're doing this, is to go through the math, is to say, look, okay, the good candidates are looking for this. I don't have the pipeline yet. Let me do the figuring out to drive the pipeline. And once I've figured out that market and start generating this pipeline, then we can get into that process of hiring. So the math really helps. Because investors are financially savvy people. They understand mathematics. So I think that's one way. The other way is a little bit more, a little bit more, well, I like to say, well, you could just comply with that request, but just very slowly.
Yeah, yeah. Instead of, like 6 AEs in a month, you're like, "Okay, we're gonna bring one on." Yeah.
Well, I'm really happy to meet the candidate you're suggesting and go, yeah, they're really great, but I'm not sure they're a fit here in the culture, or I'm not sure that, whatever. You could just comply super slowly while you're busy just doing all of the figuring out. And I think there's an important thing that might be useful for any founders listening and for any investors listening, actually. There are broadly 3 or 4 types of salespeople who will be willing to join, even if you haven't figured out this market or generate pipeline. And they are, number one, poor performers. They're generally content to work for just the base, and they're hanging their hat on the hope that you might just be one of these outlier companies that ends up having insane product market fit. And you'll normally be able to spot them because on their resume, there'll be multiple stints, 10 months, 12 months, 8 months, 9 months. You'll see that sort of pattern. And they may have started their career in a company that was successful, but then afterwards they kind of bounced around. The other type of person who's generally willing to join is, an okay performer, a middling performer who just happened to be in the right place at the right time. So they just happened to join one of those companies that had outrageous product market fit, but they're not as experienced as they think they are. And generally you'll be able to test that because when you ask them to explain the part that they played in that rocket ship, they struggle to articulate that. The third is what I like to call the sales consultant. This is someone often who just got fired for poor performance, couldn't find another role, and has refashioned themselves as a sales coach for early stage founders. And they're using that just as a stealth way to get into a permanent role. And the fourth is what I like to call the semi-retired sales leader. They're normally someone who's had a very big exit. They're in a company that had a big exit. They're kind of bored and they're like, oh, I like the energy of the early stage. I want to go back. But really, they're not motivated to do the super hard yards and do the
The
grunt
grunt
work.
work, so to speak.
And for them, it's kind of a bit more of a lifestyle choice to go work in a hip startup. And that's quite dangerous for founders, especially if you are in a hot technology space, a hot AI space, because you think, oh, this is perfect, right? This person has been on this journey and there won't be a stage fit because big company experience is rarely, if ever, backward compatible with the early stages, even if you may have been on that journey. And that's the biggest reason where I find that mishires earlier failed is they're not a stage fit.
How do you kind of suss that out in the interview process? I mean, you said the kind of signal of maybe the we call them like the job hoppers, which is a whole other topic we can talk about. But in the interview process, and especially for founders who maybe this isn't like their wheelhouse, they don't know what great looks like.
It's tough. I've got to hire someone in commercial whose job is to sell themselves, right? It's really tough. So unfortunately, I rely on old age and cynicism. So that's how I'm able to do it. Well, because, I've just made every hiring mistake there is possible to make. But what I essentially do with founders, if we've assessed that the time is right, like the timing makes sense, actually you're the bottleneck now, you've got the pipeline, you just can't close enough because, the timing isn't right. Or we feel like it will be right in 3 or 4, 5 months. So let's start looking now. First of all, what we really want to think about is a stage fit. Who is someone we can find that has been through this stage where we're at and maybe a couple of stages beyond? Because the lack of that stage experience is often the biggest reason why people fail. And it is counterintuitive if you're a technical founder. Surely I've got this momentum. I can hire someone from Google because they're so experienced. And they're like, but selling at Google is very different from selling here. They're going to come and join your company and go, where's my marketing leads? Where's my competitive battle cards? Where's my sales? I need all of this stuff around me to hit these numbers. And then the risk you have is you go, oh, okay, I didn't realize that. Here's budget, go and do all that. And then you spend millions of dollars and 2 years go by and you still haven't seen a lot of results, right? So one is stage fit. The other is to think about what are the sort of behaviors that you need. The skills are much easier to define, but what are the behaviors I need that correlate to success at our company, right? Do I need people who are collaborative, or do I need people who are analytical? Do I need people who, maybe you have a different culture? Do I need people who are super assertive, who run through brick walls? What is the profile of people who are successful here from a behavioral standpoint and start to deconstruct that for these new roles that you're hiring. The way I often explain this to founders is there are plenty of people who will be able to do this job and hit your targets that you give them or exceed those targets, but they will leave a trail of destruction behind them. Burnt relationships, alienating people internally, alienating customers even, but they'll hit the number. Now, if that's what you want, if you feel that will work, great. But if that's not what you want, let's work out the behaviors you're looking for and then define those, and then we'll test for those as well as the skills. I guess it's a way of saying it's not just what a person can do and the familiarity with the stage, it's figuring out how you want them to do it. And in my experience, how has been the bigger determiner of success in the role than necessarily the what.
I think you make this distinction in your writing to this behavior thing, the trail of destruction. And I think it's the heart of, honestly, the whole conversation we're having today. Testing between what someone can do versus how they can do it. And, behavior is this biggest predictor of success. Where does that conviction come from for you? I want to know a little bit more of the history there and, what changed when you started hiring that way.
I'm a convert to all of this. My general belief was we write a job description and we'll probably do some research on other just job descriptions out there. We'll take what we like. I like to call that now Frankenstein's job description. Job description, I don't think a lot of founders appreciate this, that is not a blueprint for being successful in a role. That's just a list of activities you want someone to do. So you're just defining what I want you to do in the role, not how I want you to do it, right? And so I would start with that. I would go meet them. I'd go test their skills, the how, right? Can you do this? Can you do that? Set you an exercise, blah, blah, blah. And then I thought, then I'll have them meet some of the team. And if the team go, yeah, this is nice, I can work with them, we'll hire them, right? And that's kind of a non-controversial way of thinking about it. But then, earlier in my career, I worked for a boss who really drilled into this idea of being like, no, the biggest predictor of success is past and present behavior, not necessarily the skill. And I was very, very skeptical about this, right? Really, until I started to go on interviews with him and to actually be his note taker, and then we would swap, and then I would do the interview and he would take the notes. And I actually realized what we're really doing when we're testing behavior is we're trying to elicit a story from the candidate about something they've really done. And one of the biggest mistakes people make in interviews is they ask hypothetical questions about what you would do. And you can't assess their behavior from that. That's a test. Most people could figure that out if they're smart. I want to know what you have done. So a really good example would be, Danielle, tell me about a time when your ideas were resisted by a prospect. What did you do? I'm trying to get a real story from you. And as you are telling me this story, I'm going to follow up everything that you say with either a follow-up question that begins with what, how, or tell me more. What was it about the objection that made you do that? How did the prospect receive that feedback? Why did you do it that way? Or if I want them just to talk more because I haven't learned enough, I go, just tell me more about that, Danielle. It sounds really simple when they lay it out, but it's something people very rarely do. Like, I'm going to ask you for an example or a situation. Could you tell me about a time when this happened? And I'm going to drill down with what, how, tell me more. I'm going to be gathering data that's going to point to your behavior. Why did you do it that way? What was the reaction? What happened when X happened? I'm checking the veracity of your story, because if you can drill down and tell me all those things, this thing clearly really happened. But I'm also checking your thinking, your approach. Why did you reach out to your boss at that point? Well, I realized that I had reached the limit of my experience and I needed to pull in someone more senior. All right, great. This person knows how to collaborate. They know when to bring in help. I'm starting to test the behaviors that I am or am not looking for.
Yeah, that's really smart. And I think drilling down, digging for more information, getting them to, as you say, test the veracity of their story, because everyone can have that on a surface level.
Yeah, surface level is absolutely the right way to describe it. Oftentimes in interviews are a process of data collection and discovery if you're doing it right. A lot of people will give a surface level answer or point to their resume, which is the ultimate surface level answer, and then no one digs any deeper. Yeah, and it's actually the digging deeper, surface level 1, level 2, level 3, that's where you will really get at the heart of the information that you're looking for.
Yeah, I think something we see is interviews can be approached as more of a checklist. And it's okay, they answered that question, so move on to the next, versus what you're saying is like the digging deeper and like maybe staying on that one question for a bit longer than even feels comfortable, but you're getting a lot more information than just like surface level answer, move on to the next, surface level answer, move on to the next.
I'll give you an example recently. I was involved in an interview process for a very, very senior sales role. I said to the candidate, professionally speaking, what are you really good at? Right? It's a nice open-ended question, right? And they listed three things. And the first one, they said, discovery. I'm really good at discovery, right? I could have left it at that, right? I'm like, great, we need to read that's on my checklist. And I'm like, can you tell me about a time you went into a meeting and did some really good discovery? Waffle, back to the resume. I'm like, yeah, I understand what you've done. I'm just wanted to know about an example, like blah, blah, blah. Started an example, but very surface level. I'm like, well, what were your opening questions there? You know, what made it a good, why does this example stick out in your mind? What made this a good discovery question? Went at a tangent, blah, blah, blah. And I ended up asking some version of that question 6 different ways in a row. And very clearly, I was like, this is not a good candidate, right? Because I started this interview. I've just got a very surface level story. And I think when you're hiring in depth, there should be 2 of you, one of you observing and taking notes and one of you leading the interview, because it's very hard to do both. My colleague who was taking the notes went back to me and said, you know, you asked him that some version of that question 6 times and he didn't answer. I go, I know. So, and he immediately knew that I had clocked that this was a red flag. And that was the pattern for the rest of the interview. You know, this is why it's really, really important to ask for real examples. Can you tell me about a time when? Can you give me an example of? And then really drill down at least 1 or 2 levels just to make sure that what we're hearing here is a real story.
Yeah, I think that's great advice for founders listening and even like, different investors advising them. And so getting into like your hiring process a little bit, just because, we're on the topic, you've spoke about this a little bit before of like the job description is more like what you want them to do. And you advocate for a hiring scorecard as an alternative built around like the missions, the outcomes, competencies. For a founder who's hearing this and is like, oh my God, what is a hiring scorecard? Help me. How does that actually look like in practice? What would you tell a founder that's coming to you?
Yeah, it's a really great question, Danielle. So if we think about the job description as a list of activities, the hiring scorecard is the blueprint for the role, right? So in the same way that you would not hopefully start building a house without a blueprint, you should not go into hiring without a blueprint.
Just vibe house building.
Yeah, exactly. And so the idea of this scorecard was pioneered by 2 guys, Randy Street and Jeff Smart. And if anyone's interested listening, they wrote an excellent book called Who, which is a framework for hiring. And chapter 2 of that book introduces this idea of the scorecard, right? So really what the scorecard is, it's internal only. We don't give it to the candidate. It's for every single interviewer. It can be an A4 page or a letter page, depending on where you are in the world. And it's made up of 3 parts, right? The first part is the mission of the role. In other words, why does this role exist at our company? And that mission needs to be in very clear, simple language, very short, that anyone in the company can understand. The reason being is you're going to ask other people not in this function to be involved in the interview process, right? So no jargon, no thing. A really good example is the mission of the AE role at our company is to own a territory of companies of 100 to 500 employees and meet and exceed their quarterly target. Everybody can understand that, right? That's the mission, right? The next part of the scorecard is the outcomes, right? So we've talked about why the role exists. This is what the role is required to achieve, right? And so the outcomes are either measurable things, pipeline generation target or quota or some KPI that you can measure, or if it's a role where there aren't necessarily KPIs, it's something observable that you can see happened or did not happen. For example, an outcome might be for a marketing hire, we'll release our version 1 marketing plan after the first 90 days. That's an outcome. So measurable. So in other words, they're either KPIs that you want them to achieve or they're outcomes. And in the book, Street and Smart talk about this idea of A players. What you want to do is hire an A player. And they define that as the 10% of candidates that have a 90% or better chance of achieving those outcomes, right? That's how they define it. So those outcomes should be achievable, but only by that rare 10%. So in other words, there should be a bit of a stretch, achievable, but a stretch. And the reason you want to do that is B and C players will ultimately self-select themselves out of the process once they realize, actually, I'm going to have to hit some kind of target that I know is not attainable. An A player will be like, I'm up for the challenge. I've done this before, right? So there's the mission, why this role exists. There's the outcomes. What is this role required to produce and in what time frame? And I would typically say have no more than 2, 3, 4 outcomes because it's hard to test for that. And then the real meat of the scorecard is what we call the competencies. And the competencies are the behaviors that you're looking for and the skills that translate from those behaviors. So, for example, you may want to have a competency that says, we're looking for a communication competency, right? I want the behavior of someone as a good communicator. Well, what's the skills associated with that? Well, in our company, that means you can you can communicate briefly. You can adjust your communication style depending on the audience because you may have to talk to junior people and senior people. Maybe we may want to have someone who's got skills of communicating effectively over different mediums, written, presenting, etc. So the behavior is communication, but the skills we can define. Similarly, collaborative, right? Knows how to work in a team, knows how to bring in people to help them achieve a goal, is open to coaching and mentoring others, right? So you start to deconstruct these behaviors into skills. And then the goal is to probably have no more than 7, 8, 9 of those competencies. Any more than that, it becomes very hard to test unless you have round after round after round of interview.
Yeah, which those A players are not going to love.
Yeah, exactly. So what I generally suggest is 7 to 9, break them up in chunks of 2s to 3s and maybe 4s, split that over 2 or 3 of the team, and maybe just do these interviews back to back, right? Have the candidate come in and just go, right, we're going to focus on these 3 things for 45 minutes, etc., etc. And you collect the results in the scorecard. The rating can be, thumbs up, thumbs down. Some people do traffic lights, but I've seen that doesn't work so well because people start sneaking in different colors. They go, well, it's not quite red, but it's a kind of orange. I personally prefer, meets, does not meet, exceeds, something like that. You will all put your scores down. And then when the candidate's been through the whole process, you will all sit down and review how you felt about all those competencies, hash out where there's discrepancies, and make a hire, no hire decision. So it's a way of actually having a bit more structure and collecting data in a structured fashion. So I've seen this work incredibly effectively for technical founders who've never hired commercial roles because they go, oh, I can deconstruct this now and collect the right data and I know how to do it.
That was the next question I have is this part is, the hardest part and like not just defining what you want someone to do, but how you want them to do it and testing for that too. And for a technical founder who's like never worked in sales, maybe doesn't know this profile, doesn't know what great looks like, this helps them get really specific about those behaviors. And like you said, it helps them like approach it with that more technical mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. The way I always present this part to founders who want to do it is to say, what behaviors do you feel, knowing your company, correlate to success in this role, in that team, and in the company as a whole? And so often what we'll do is say, do you have any company values that you've defined? Let's walk through those and let's try to deconstruct those to see how those values map to behaviors. And let's then put those behaviors in the scorecard. And that's often a very good place to start. In the event that you are really struggling to kind of define any behaviors because maybe you haven't quite thought through your values, etc., I would say to founders, if you're really struggling, the behaviors you're looking for are humble, hardworking, collaborative, and intelligent. So if you've got nothing else, test for those 4 because that's a pretty good baseline for just about any role.
Yeah, I like that. That's a good one. So we talked about this towards the top of the interview. One of the hardest things about go-to-market mishires, as opposed to coding, engineering, you can kind of see maybe things aren't adding up right away, but there's this 12 to 18 month before a mishiring go-to-market actually surfaces, like the what's happening. Are there any earlier signals that founders should be watching for? And at what point do you say, like, this isn't someone settling in, like this is actually a problem and we need to move on?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And it's contextual and it will vary, but I think some of the common things are like, you see cherry picking of work. There's only some things I'm going to do. Some things, oh, that's not me. We need to hire a role for that. And it's like, hey, you don't join an early stage startup that you do it because you roll out the sleeves to do everything. So there's that. There's obviously just persistent excuses, or actually it's because we don't have these feedback. We don't have these features, or because blah, blah, blah. I think some of that is a challenge. I think also if you get, you should also poll the sort of peer feedback around those people. What do they like to work with? Are they reaching out to you? Or if they are reaching out to you, I think sometimes the support people are often some of the best people to ask if you're assessing a salesperson, go, how is your interaction with them? Oh, they're kind of really aggressive when they're dealing with a prospect and they've got a ticket and blah, blah, blah. And you start to get other data points. But I think if as a founder, you're sort of struggling a bit to understand if it's working or not, that is a signal that you've actually removed yourself from sales too much and too early. Because if you've been doing founder-led sales, the next stage is not to hire a salesperson and walk away. The next step is to transition into founder managed sales. So now I'm managing the people doing sales. And if you're finding you're struggling to see really how they're doing, or you're just getting snippets that maybe not going well, you've probably removed yourself from managing that person in a meaningful way.
I think that's really interesting. Can you talk a little bit more about that transition from founder-led sales to founder-managed sales and what that looks like and how you know that you're not too far removed, but you're also not too in the weeds? Like that's interesting.
So let's just say you've got to the point where you've been selling as a founder, you've identified at least one market where that works, enough to teach this new AE, for example. For the first quarter or so, you're probably going to be like their sales engineer, right? You're going to be on calls with them. They're going to be leading the calls and you're going to be in the background, and then you want to be giving them feedback after the calls, correction, blah, blah, blah. Your job at that stage, when you are no longer maybe directly selling or selling as much, is to focus on quality. That's your job. How are the first calls going? What is the quality of our discovery? How are our demos going? That's what you should be close enough to assess the quality and to be able to give minor corrective action or coaching. That's how close you need to be. Then you are then comfortable that actually, yes, I think this is going well and it's going to a high degree of quality. Then you can actually start to maybe extricate yourself a bit more. But I think that's a very under discussed thing, that you go from founder led sales to founder managed sales. You still have to manage the sales function, right?
Yeah, that's why I wanted to kind of dig in deeper to that, because, and we see this too, is sometimes someone comes in and is like, oh, I want to hire an AE or, a God forbid, a CRO, because I don't want to be in sales anymore. And they think that, okay, I'm out of founder led sales. And this kind of, this founder managed sales, I think, is a really interesting topic too.
I think part of the problem, Danielle, is that if I was a technical founder, the only things I'm reading about and hearing about are effectively outlier companies that have made 100 million in ARR in 6 months with 3 people, right? Or at the other end, the Anthropics and the OpenAIs. Now, I know for a fact that all of those companies have hardcore, deeply experienced enterprise B2B salespeople working in them, because I used to work with a lot of them, and some of them are my friends. But that's kind of kept opaque from the because it's not a good story, right? Like it's, the story is that the product's so good it sells itself. And so I think it can be hard sometimes for founders to say, well, okay, I've got to do the selling bit, I've got to figure that out. But now we're making money, I can completely outsource that to somebody else. Even when you're $100 million company and you have a CRO, you're managing the CRO, right?
Yeah.
Right? So you're still managing sales, right? So I think that's the thing that founders need to realize, is that if I want to build a big enterprise or B2B company, I can't do that, no matter how good the product is, without either doing sales or managing sales. And I might move higher up that sales management hierarchy as we get bigger, but I'm still managing it, because you are focused on quality. But also, the other really important thing is your product market fit is constantly evolving. And if you are, you've got to be close to it, right? Because if you are not close enough to it to understand what problems and pains you need to be solving on an ongoing basis for your customers, guess what? The sales is going to plateau. Or still a competitor is going to be in there going, oh, well, they're not addressing this in their roadmap. We will. So even as a technical founder or a product founder, the value in doing any kind of sales is it will allow you to constantly iterate on your PMF and keep it tight, because you're talking to the people who are closest to the problem.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Thank you for going into that. I want to go back to something you said earlier in the interview, because I love this, because we see it all the time. The Frankenstein job description, our favorite, the copy paste approach, where founders kind of like pull bits from, I like this, and like I get it, I get why it happens, because you've never hired for this before. You want to look at what the best are doing.
Right? Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So I want to know a little bit more of like why starting there is so dangerous, and kind of the risks and maybe what you should do instead.
Yeah. So I think starting there is not necessarily a problem. It's only a problem if that's all you do, right? I'm going to pull together this job description, I'm going to put it out to the world, and then let's see what happens, or I'll hire a recruitment function, right? The next bit is to do before you, as in, before you've got the job description, but the next bit is to do the scorecard work. As in, what is the mission? What are the outcomes? What are the behaviors? What are the questions we're going to ask when we screen to test some of those things? Because what you really want to do as a founder is not have a giant funnel of candidates coming at you, because you just don't have the time. You want a smaller funnel of closer match candidates. And that's what the scorecard will let you do, because that's how you will calibrate candidates that either apply directly or that a recruiter is finding for you, right? I need these, 4 or 5 key things. I want you to check for these before sending anyone through to me. The reason often poor performers slip through is we did the job description, we didn't do the scorecard thinking bit, and so we let so many people through the funnel that we ended up just getting sold on someone who was very good at selling themselves, because we didn't really have a yardstick or a filter to look at them through. So starting with a job description is not necessarily a bad thing. It's bad if that's the only thing that you do.
Yeah, if you don't go that level deeper, like we've been talking about. Yeah. All right, I got one more question. So we've got founders listening to this and they're like, okay, it's time. I need to make that go-to-market hire. They've done your OTE math, maybe they know it's the right move. But they don't come from a sales background. They're, the classic technical founder. And they don't know what great looks like for this function. So what's the first 1 or 2 things you want them to do? What do you want them to really take away from this conversation that we've had today?
Well, I think one of the key things, and it's not just go-to-market hiring, but it's just overlooked in hiring in early stage companies in general, is testing a candidate's intrinsic motivation to join you. You have a need and you are focused on your need. I need someone in sales, or I need this role in marketing, or whatever it is. I need this role. You are clearly only going to hire people who are very, very good at what they're doing and have a good track record and are delivering results. Why on earth would they leave a successful company and role to join you where the risk of failure is much higher? You have to test this intrinsic motivation, right? And so that is, I think, what is really should be done at a screening stage. The first interaction is test things. So what I've seen work really well is, so let's say, Danielle, like you're a hot shot B2B marketer, you're known in the industry. I'm kind of a hot startup, but I'm small. Well, I'm going to ask you and say, Danielle, thinking about your career moving forward, whatever you do next, what career goals are you looking to achieve? Because what I want to hear from you is goals that match what I have on the scorecard and the job description. So what you want to do next in your career needs to be something we're offering. If you're saying, well, actually, next in my career, I want to be CMO, I'm like, well, I need a demand gen marketer. That's not going to work, right? Right. So, so again, that's the first question I always ask. Next question I always ask is, professionally speaking, what do you feel you're really good at, Daniel? And what I want to hear is that the things that you feel you're really good at are on my scorecard. I actually think I'm really, really good at being analytical and being data-driven. Tell me more about that, right? Give me an example of that, because that's on my scorecard. I want to know more about that, right? Then I always like to flip it around and say, what are you not so good at professionally? What do you think still needs work? It's a good question to test someone's self-awareness behavior. It's a really good test if they essentially tell you a strength and disguise it as a weakness. Well, the thing is, Rav, I'm such a perfectionist. That's like my biggest problem, right? To which I always say, hey, that sounds like a strength to me. What are you really not good at? And again, what you're testing for is, are they saying some of the things that they say they're really not good at? Is that on my scorecard? Do I need it? The third thing that I'd like to ask them is, for your next role, whether it's with us or somewhere else, is there professionally anything you don't want to do? And that's been super interesting. And I always caveat, they go, there may be nothing, but I'm just curious in case there is. Sometimes I've had candidates tell me, well, I definitely don't want to do this, this, and this, and that's required in our job. Then I sort of always ask, you're obviously doing very well where you are. Why do you want to leave? That needs to be a valid career reason, right? That needs to be a really valid career reason. That can be money. I'm perfectly happy with that. But it's got to be some I'm happy where I am, but we're such a big organization. For me to accelerate where I want to go to, it's going to take me 5-6 years. I feel like if I join a company at your stage, I could really demonstrate my value and accelerate my career quicker. Something like that could be, actually, I've worked in your technology space and I realize how much I miss it. I want to get back to it. It's got to be a valid career reason. And then I always ask what I call the threat of reference check question. It's like, who is your current boss? And no matter how simple the name is, I get them to spell it out and I write it down. And I go, if you are successful through this process and you decide you want to join us and we decide we want to have you, I'm going to ring Danielle. How is she going to rate your performance on a scale of 1 to 10? Right? And then I get them to unpack why. And that why should match the things they're professionally really good at and should match what's on my scorecard. So why leave and then why join us? Because if you are really good at what you do, you should be inundated with options at least of where to go. What is it about us? I want to understand your intrinsic motivation of joining us specifically. So those are kind of things I think, well, hopefully that's useful in terms of just to have those questions. But the key goal is before you get into skills, before you get into behaviors, make sure you're comfortable with that person's intrinsic motivation, because I have to have it. They're taking a risk joining a startup.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is like the consistency across the story, the reasons for wanting to join have to align and be legitimate, not like, probably feel like I'm going to get fired soon, so I'm trying to look for something else. And an earlier stage role is a good one to go to.
They're in a hot space and I want to have a hot name on my CV, right? So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rob. I feel like this conversation could go on for like 2 more hours, but want to be respectful of everyone's time. But thank you so much for joining us today. I feel like this was a really great conversation that founders are going to learn so much of. So I can't wait to get it out there.
Yeah, my pleasure. And thank you for inviting me along. I hope it's been helpful.
What I keep coming back to from today's conversation with Rav is how much of the damage actually happens pre-interview, before a single candidate is in the funnel, from not knowing if you're actually ready to make that hire, from Frankensteining the job descriptions, or not looking for those behaviors like Rav was talking about. If you want to go deeper on any of the frameworks or notes that Rav discussed in today's episode, we will be sure to link those in the description. And if this episode was helpful, please like, comment, share, subscribe, do all of the above to help other founders going through this process. We'll see you next time on Human First.